Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fourth and final hangout of the fall. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our grand finale for our fall series, and we have a really special guest today. Jim Stikeleather is Dell's Chief Innovation Officer, and he is joining us so that you can ask him anything. Also joining us, we have two Florida Poly students who are going to help me field questions and ask questions. We have Colin Hedka, who is a sophomore majoring in logistics and supply chain management. And we also have Kylie White, who is a sophomore majoring in nanotechnology. Thank you for joining us, both of you. I want to give a little bit of an intro to Jim. Jim has been with Dell for 25 years, has 25 years in the business, developing and implementing communications and information technologies. He has written a number of books and articles and served on a number of technology protocol boards. And he's worked for businesses as small as startups. He started many of his own companies and obviously worked for a global enterprise like Dell. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Now, viewers, if you have questions for Jim as we go throughout the Hangout, you can tweet them using the hashtag STEMTalks, or you can type them into the Google Hangout screen below. But I get to ask the first question. And Jim, I want to know, what does a Chief Innovation Officer do exactly, and how do you get to be that role?
Innovate and get in a lot of trouble. That's the simple answer. No. The role of Chief Innovation Officer is different from companies to company. I can talk about my role within Dell. The role that I have is not what you think. I don't innovate Dell's products and services. My role is to help Dell itself to be a more innovative company. So I'm focusing on the ability of Dell to innovate rather than innovating Dell's products and services. There are a number of dimensions to that. One is we provide innovation training, which a lot of people think is an oxymoron, but it isn't. You can actually help people become more innovative. There are tools and techniques that you can teach to them, and there's some things that you can do just to get them to think out of the box a little bit more than they normally would. We've also helped them. We have a process that helps them actually do a better job of defining the challenge or opportunity they're addressing. We give them tools that they can use for their own creativity, but as well as bringing in other sources to help them be more creative. So really one part of our function is actually helping the people within Dell be more creative. We also provide, as part of that function, a foresight and an insight capability. Most innovation is not really about addressing today's problem. That's really something that you want TQM and Six Sigma and whatever to fix existing things. Mostly you're talking about the future. So my team prepares what we call FutureCast. We're looking at the demographics of society and how it's changing, how society itself is changing, how business is changing, the legal and regulatory environments, how technology is changing, but not technology in terms of forecasting how fast the computers are going to be, but technology in terms of what are people willing to use technology for? What are the new usage patterns of technology? So we take all of that and we package it up and we deliver it to the organization as scenarios of the future. And we were talking a little bit before we got started that what we do is we basically write science fiction stories that people can then use to apply to their particular challenge or opportunity. We've started doing the same thing with customers. Originally, the intent was for us to work internally, but we're now working with customers and helping them set up groups like my group, as well as helping them address their future challenges and opportunities and figure out exactly what their science fiction stories are and how they go about it. Now, in terms of how you get to be a science fiction writer, now you know what my real aspiration is. How do you get to be a Chief Innovation Officer? In my case, it literally was, how much trouble can you get into? Because the real key to innovation is your ability to fail, learn from your failings, and move forward. And so because I'm a serial entrepreneur and I have a better than average batting average, but if you don't know what that is, well, I'm not going to tell you what it is because most people don't realize how often new startups fail and what's involved in that. But the reality is, I'm somewhat of a polyglot. One of the things that we're currently, Florida Poly is a STEM. One of the things that we're pushing within our organization is STEAM, We have plenty of STEM within a technology company. We need to get some of the arts into it. So we push STEAM instead of STEM. It's that broad perspective. It's having been in multiple roles. My background is scientific. I come from the hard sciences, but it is experiencing the world in a lot of startup capabilities and a lot of challenges, and then bringing it together within a large organization. So, we were joking beforehand, if you take a look at my resume, it looks like I can never keep a job, and that's probably true, and that's probably one of the key criteria for a Chief Innovation Officer, at least in the role that I have.
So, as a logistician, being in the logistics and supply chain, we were talking a little bit before. When I was reading your job description, to me, it reads exactly like a logistics person would do. But before, when we were talking, one of the things you said is the key to success and innovation is acceptance of repeated failure, and not just in your supply chain, in everything that you guys do, especially in the innovation of how you actually run your business. So it's interesting to me, and I just wanted to ask you, for everyone else viewing, how you apply these methods, and is it a taught thing or a culture thing or just a character type thing that gives you the ability to do these things?
In the beginning, and I won't get too terribly biblical on you, but in the beginning, you literally is a function of failing a lot. People talk about processes for innovation. Yes, there are, but they aren't processes for innovation as much as they are. It's I don't know if any of you have ever ridden a mechanical bull, but the way you want to learn to ride a mechanical bull is not just get on the bull, but get on the bull and surround the floor with pillows. And that's in effect what our group does. Is we've learned from the hard experiences, and it's not what works and what doesn't work, because depending on the situation, what didn't work yesterday might work incredibly well today. So how do you put all of this kind of stuff together? Your analogy of supply chain is correct, because when you start looking at the highly innovative ideas, they're always coming from different directions than what you're expecting. In fact, they're often usage patterns of a technology or usage patterns of a business model or a business process that existed in some other field that has then been brought into a new field. We actually have a term, we call it relative innovation, where we will discover something going on, for example, in our healthcare customers that we can pick and bring up to our banking, finance, and insurance customers, and vice versa. So it's primarily experience. There's some learnings that are involved. You can pick up some of Cheeseborough's work. You can pick up some of Clayton Christensen's work, and you can get general ideas how to go about it. But at the end of the day, it's developing an intuition and an instinct. It's almost a deep learning neural network pattern recognition process that you go through. I think the other piece of it is getting the problem in most cases is to get an organization to become innovative is to get an organization to be able to think out of the box, to be willing to tolerate a certain amount of failure. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's something called the marshmallow experiment. There are two. There's one where kids have to look at a marshmallow for 10 minutes and not eat one in order to get more. But there's another one where people are given 20 pieces of spaghetti, uncooked, duct tape, some string, a marshmallow, and the goal is to build a tower with a marshmallow on top of it. Interesting thing. Guess who has the least success?
Engineers?
No, fortunately, they tend to have the best of success, because if they didn't, we would be in real trouble. No, it turns out that graduate students in other science, in fact, the worst performance is MBA students. I hope no MBA students are listening. And the reason is they are taught there is only one right answer. And by the way, most undergraduate engineering students are also taught that. They don't do well. Graduate students in engineering tend to have experienced failure on a regular basis, so therefore they understand that. But you have this entire curriculum where we teach people you cannot fail. Now, given that I've given that explanation, who do you think does best in a test? Historically, except for basically architects and construction engineers. Kindergarten students. They will consistently outperform any other group. And why is it? They're totally willing to fail. I mean, if I were to hand one of you, here's this project, I need you to get it done, you've got 90 days to do it in, you would sit down and you start laying out a plan, say we need to do this, 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 and this, and this, and by this time we need to do this, we need to do this, and do this. And when you get to the end, what's it like? Every engineering project in the world ends the same way, scurrying around because we're not going to make it, right? You give that to a bunch of kindergarten students, what are they going to do? Well, let's try this and see, oh, that didn't work. Okay, let's try this. Oh, wait, that sort of worked. Well, let's try this. It's the whole concept of serial failure and coming, that's where creativity comes from. It comes from failing. The engineers have started using the term rapid prototyping, circular prototyping, and other terms like that. The reality it is, find the minimal possible thing I can do. Let's do it, and it fails. Then we learn from it and go forward. I think I kind of ran around the circle in answering your question, but that's basically it. Is developing a tolerance for failure is probably the key capability if you want to be a good innovator.
All right. I know beforehand we talked about. I wanted to know like what this meant for nanotechnology going forward, like how we can measure because it's such an innovative field right now. But like, is there really a way you can measure innovation, or is it just something that happens?
It's not that it's something that happens, but when it happens, it has significant unexpected consequences associated with it. We were talking a little bit before the break. There is something, and I indicated that one of the things that my team does is we provide these future casts. And there's actually a science for doing it. If you're interested, the University of Houston actually has a structured forecasting program that you can actually take online. But the idea is this concept, and I shared with you Amara's law, that I know I've got this great technology and it's going to do great things, but the problem is we as humans, we tend to overestimate what a technology is going to do in the short term, and then we get disappointed, and then we find out a few years later that it does even more than we ever expected to be. The way Ray Amara expressed it was that we significantly underestimate technology in the short term. I mean, significantly overestimate technology in the short term and significantly underestimate it in the long term. That's why making predictions about the future are so hard. Every once in a while, you will get in a technology environment which is a little bit predictable, because there's Moore's law within computers that every 18 months performance will double and price will cut in half. Well, that's a fairly easy prediction. What are you going to do with that extra computer power? That's where the difficulty comes into. There's a famous quote from the guy who headed digital equipment, and he was so famous I have just now forgotten his name, who basically said, why would anybody in the world want a computer in their home? Well, I'm sitting here right now looking at least 7 of them sitting and I may be a little weird, and I'll accept that. So the issue is not forecasting the technology. The issue becomes, how does one anticipate the usage patterns of, and not the technology, the capabilities the technology is going to deliver. That's where it gets incredibly difficult. But that's where the money's to be made. I mean, who would have ever thought of something like Facebook, or who would ever have thought of something like Google? It wasn't the underlying technology. The technology had always been there to do that. What was the usage pattern was where the creativity is, which is what we teach. Most innovation is a function, more than products and services, is a function of business processes and business models and the usage patterns that someone might apply a technology to. And that makes it difficult because you have to be really creative to figure out that somebody might do something that nobody's ever done before. That's really kind of, and plus you have to be brave. I jokingly, we joke within the team all the time. Well, there's 2 difficulties to innovation. First is being able to think of something that nobody else has ever thought of, because that's not how we're taught in our schools, for the most part. And the other is to be brave enough to do it. The classic example is, man, don't you think the guy who ate the first oyster was really brave? I mean, think about it for a second. And then you also have to be able to take a risk. You look, the guy that we use for the example is either the dumbest man in the world or the smartest man in the world. And that's the guy who bought the first fax machine. What good is a fax machine if there's nobody else got one? But it turned out he knew where it was going. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's how you have to think about it.
Jimmy, you've touched on this in a couple of answers now. First, I'm talking about kindergartners and spaghetti and marshmallows, and a little bit in this last answer. But you say that failure is important. Can you talk a little bit more about failure and why that's important, and maybe any experiences that you've had that were great failures or great learning experiences?
Interesting use of a term, a great failure. And we only have an hour tonight, so I obviously can't go over my entire failure experience, but thank you for bringing it up. Here's the problem, and here's why you don't see as much innovation in large companies as you see in smaller companies and in startups. And it comes from the fact that if you really look at how companies are organized, they are basically organized to make no mistakes. If you hire on to a large company, the first thing they hand you is the policy manual. It's about this thick. It tells you everything that you ever needed to know about doing anything within the company. It tells you absolutely nothing about doing something the company hasn't thought about beforehand. And then there are all of these controls that have been put in place over time, mostly because somebody made a mistake somewhere in the past, and now we're going to put some policy in place to make sure we never make that mistake again. But you probably would never have made that mistake in the first place because it was once in a 500-year mistake anyway, but you now have a policy and procedure to cover it. Well, the same thing is true in innovation. Let's say that I come up with a creative idea in most large companies. And I go to my boss and I say, it's a great idea. Well, first off, his reaction is going to be, yes, that's a great idea, but we can't do it because nobody's ever done it before. I mean, seriously, that is not an unusual conversation to have with upper-level management. Show me the experience, give me the data, who's best practice, who's done it before, so that we can follow. That's just the nature of business, because nobody, wants to be the first guy to eat an oyster. Because, unfortunately, it was a good oyster. If it had been a bad oyster, we would not be eating oysters these days. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is large companies can't do small things. The key to learning is lots of little bitty failures and building up to it. And there's a famous Edison quote that said, before he had succeeded, Mr. Edison, are you disappointed? And his answer was, no, of course not. I now know 900 ways how not to make a light bulb. I mean, he literally tried over 1,000 different filaments before he figured out, what we were sitting around. Well, we now have LEDs, but still, for 60, 70 years, the basis of all electricity was from his over 1,000 individual failures before he got it right. Well, large companies can't afford to do it, because if you start a project in a large company, you say, okay, well, we got to put a budget together, we got to put a plan together, and you need a project manager, you need a program manager, you're going to have somebody who's going to have to report out, you're going to have to report out, every 30, 60. You're not going to take on a project with that much overhead unless it's a big project. Well, the problem with big projects is they become what was the term we used in the financial crash recently? Too big to fail. As soon as the project gets to a certain size in large companies, suddenly there's so much involved with it. It's too big to fail. We joke within. Actually, we don't joke. We've actually got some evidence, but we talk about at conferences. Excuse me. That there are only two immortal beings in the universe. One is God, and the other is an IT project. No IT project ever quits. It's always, it can't fail. So when you put all of this stuff together, what you suddenly realize that it's hard for a large company to be innovative because it's got all of this against it. It's everything around the company is organized not to fail, and if something is going to fail, you will continue to put resources in it to keep it from failing, and as a consequence, you never learn anything. I mean, think about Mother Nature, the great innovator. I mean, life exists everywhere and anywhere, and it's basically because she has no problem killing off her children for all intents and purposes. It's a great experiment. It didn't work. It died. But we learned something. We evolve and we move on. So the key is to be able to create little tiny, minimal, in fact, you're starting to hear the term in lean startups of minimal viable product. And what they're talking about is what is the least thing that we can create, that we can put out in the market, knowing that it's probably going to fail, but we will learn a lot from it. And gradually, over time, all of those learnings add up, like Edison's 999 or whatever it was, filaments, until finally, eureka, it works. And that's where the whole problem comes into, is your ability to tolerate failure. But part of that is your ability to construct something that's so small, if it fails, you don't get in trouble. So that's the flip side of it, is being able to construct it that way.
So striking a balance between small great failures is what you're going for.
Yeah, you want absolutely outstanding, incredible failures that itty tiny that nobody notices that you failed, but you learn from the process. And then you do lots of them. And I think the other thing is, and it's one of the things that when we're working with companies we really have a hard time getting them to come to, is when you're looking at innovation, you have to look at innovation as a portfolio. You can't measure every innovation project as a standalone. You have to take them and bring them together, because it's almost a venture capital play if you think about it. I'm going to start 10 companies. 7 of them are going to fail miserably and I'm going to lose a ton of money. 2 of them will kind of break even, and that's okay, but 1 of them will make so much money that next year I'm going to start 10 more companies. That's the same thing in innovation, is start thinking of it in terms of small is beautiful. Failure is a wonderful experience. Thank you, sir. Give me another. And deal with it as a portfolio. It is the summation of them that's going to cause you to be successful, not any one. And you can't pick the one that's going to succeed. You don't know. By definition, you're doing something that hasn't been done before. Now, it gets more difficult when you start talking about business models and more major type of things, but the same principles apply as finding that minimal viable product.
So one thing you said earlier was a lot of companies in higher up management will do, if someone comes to them, oh, it hasn't been done before, we're not going to do it. So do you think that in industry, in any particular industry, for one, that there's innovation stagnation, or if there are companies that we could be trying to inspire them to get innovation going? Because I know you guys, before we started talking, were talking about how your team has gone to other businesses now and helped them create teams like your own. So what do you think the impact would be if we were able to get big corporations that have the ability to influence the masses to all start innovating again? Because I think in today's society, there's a leanness that people try to sustain or maintain. And as a logistics person, I'm probably the culprit of this. We try to maintain the leanest production possible. And I mean, on this sheet it says, is innovation disruptive? And I think we've come to the fact that it is. So my question is, what do you think would happen if we were able to inspire standing corporations to get back into innovation?
I think it would, and it would be inappropriate for large corporations to get back into innovation. And hear me out. Again, the key to innovation is smallness and ability to fail. And the ability to fail is 2 parts. It's your tolerance for failure, but your ability to carry the finances of the failure. And it is truly a probabilistic game, okay? It is, even today, with everything that's in there, you're still looking at a 90+, and actually it's 99% failure rates of startups and new ideas. It may actually even be higher than that. And it would be, and I'll even use the term unethical for the management of a large company to put the entire company at risk for a probabilistic game. That being said, how you're seeing companies adapt to that is a focus on inorganic innovation versus organic innovation. You know, this is a great time to be doing a startup. I mean, one of the things that you'll notice is there are very few IPOs on the market, initial public offerings on the market anymore. And the reason is the nature of the venture capitalists and the private equity people is to focus on getting companies to the point that a large company will buy them. And if you start looking at what large companies are doing, they are less being innovative internally as much as they are going up and buying up small companies that have been innovative. I mean, if you take a look at Dell, we've acquired, I want to say, a little over 20 companies just in the last 5 years. And that's not a reflection on our inability to innovate. It's a reflection on that you have a large company, which is, even in the most advanced company, is still a command and control model. You know, I'm always amazed that we in the United States, poo-pooed the Soviet Union because of its command and control model, and the fact all of our corporations are basically run the same way the Soviet Union was, but that's another story. But these small companies are functioning in a true, and you'll keep hearing me use the term Darwinian crucible, because what we are seeing happen is changes in the economy that is making business much more Darwinian than it ever was. I give you an example. I'll tell you a story. Two guys decide they're going to go fishing. So they get their fishing rods and their reels, and they get in their boat, and they paddle out to the middle of the lake, and they're casting and they're reeling, and they're casting and they're reeling. And they look at each other, and they realize that if they made a little minor modification to that reel, they could catch a whole lot more fish. Unless they're good old Southern boys and they realize they can catch the same amount of fish and drink more beer. But the effect is exactly the same, right? So they go out and they row back in, and they go home and they get on their PC and they call up a software as a service CAD/CAM program, which is available everywhere. Thanks to the makers movement, there are CAD drawings for very much anything in the world. You can literally print out, 3D print an automobile now. So they get the drawings. They make a minor modification. They basically ship it off to FedEx Kinko's, who's in the process of putting 3D printers in all their locations. They print it out, they assemble it, they show it to their friends, they make some recommendations, they take it, they open up a Kickstarter campaign. Let's say they raise $10,000, $15,000 in the Kickstarter campaign. They ship the CAD file over to an offshore job shop manufacturer. They contact UPS and they set up their logistics and distribution model. They open up an Amazon storefront. And 30 days later, they're going deep-sea fishing in their 90-foot yacht. That's the nature of the current economy. All of if you had gone back just 20 years, the amount of capital and investment that would have been necessary for those two guys to get there was enormous. You know, I joke that I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I can remember going to banks and saying, "Look, I got this great idea. I need $10,000, and I'm going to make us all rich." And they would say, "Mr. Stikeleather, you're a great customer of ours, and because of that, the coffee is over there. Have all the donuts you want, and when you're done, the door's over there." And then, compare that to Michael Dell deciding he's got the same exact idea, and he comes to the bank and he says, "I need $10 million because we're a big company and we have overhead and stuff, so we can't do it for $10,000." And the reaction to the bank is, "Mr. Dell, that's great and that's wonderful. If you'll go upstairs, the champagne and caviar is on ice, and when you're done eating, we'll have the contract drawn up for you." That was the distinction of access to capital just 10 years ago. Oculus Rift, the virtual reality glasses, raised $42 million on Kickstarter, and the SEC has finally caught up and said we need to make it easier to do those things. So the consequence is a large company cannot keep up. I mean, think about it. What was the single most efficient organism to ever trod on Mother Earth? Excuse me. It was the huge dinosaurs, the Brontosaurus and the Diplodocus, if I said that right. They were the most efficient at converting food into mass and energy. But they were so efficient that as soon as the environment changed, poof, they're gone. And who in their place now rules the earth? We terribly inefficient mammals, and we're horribly energy inefficient compared to what the dinosaurs were. There's a lesson in that. What do we have in large companies? Large companies get large because they make their margins on the scale, efficiency, and productivity they can achieve. As soon as you break away all of the frictions of access to capital, access to information, I mean, think about those two guys. Two good old boys rowing out into the middle of a lake. What was the likelihood they would be able to do high-level engineering 20 years ago? Zero. Can they do it today? Yes, they can do it. They don't even have to know engineering. There's little help things that will help them get there. So you put all of that together, you begin to realize that the role of the large companies are kind of like the pond in an ecosystem. They're an environment that all of these small things can actually compete and interact with. And so the role of a large company becomes much more the facilitator and the enabler for the Darwinian crucible to take place. And then your model, your business models, your management models, your operational models, all of those begin to change. So, and that's what we're starting to see large companies do. Boy, that was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I know we've kind of touched on this, but we have someone from the internet whose name we don't have that wants to know how an organization fosters innovation.
I basically have answered that a couple of ways. I think the first thing is building up this tolerance for failure. Doesn't mean that you're going to, and I'm not an advocate of celebrating failure. I'm an advocate of celebrating learning and being able to differentiate between the two. So that's kind of the starting point for fostering innovation. The second starting point of is the level of transparency and communication. One of the things that we find when we do the research on what it takes to be innovative is, first and foremost, very rarely is innovation an individual sport. Innovation is very much a team sport. In fact, we've identified 3 personas for innovation. The first persona is the idea generator, the person who actually comes up with the idea. Idea generators are generally notoriously ineffective in manifesting their ideas or talking to people about their ideas. The fallacy of the lone inventor is pretty high. So that means you need a second person, an engineer, who can manifest the idea that the idea generator created. So you have an idea generator, you have an idea manifester, and then most importantly, you need an idea communicator. And the idea communicator is the person who can translate the capabilities of that innovation into outcomes that people want to achieve. I often get a pushback when I start talking about that and say, well, what about Steve Jobs? Well, think about Steve. Steve was the idea generator. He was always having ideas, but he had this friend called Woz who was the idea manifester. There would not have been an Apple I or II if it wasn't for Woz. And most people don't know who Regis McKenna is, but Regis McKenna was the marketing guy that put Apple on the map. If it hadn't been for him, there wouldn't have been a map. They're all 3 there. And the reason I say that is what we often see in companies is, okay, if you're going to be an innovator, you go off and go take care of it. Well, one person can't go off and he needs the support system to do it. So in addition to this tolerance, this appetite for learning, I've got to change my language. Instead of saying tolerance for failure, I need to say appetite of learning. You have to have this appetite of learning, and then you have to have the willingness to invest in teams as opposed to individuals. That's the other thing. And then the level of transparency to be able to say, hey, it failed, we learned from it, let's go try it again. I think those are the key things. I think after that, then you have to go back and really address the organizational dynamics. You don't want to put on innovators, program managers, project managers, budget accountants, which a lot of organizations do. Great idea, we're going to turn it into a project. So one of the ways is having this tolerance for ambiguity in the innovation process. I can't predict exactly what it will be able to do. I can tell you what I'm striving for, but don't hold me to a revenue forecast when I'm just barely getting the thing out the door. So it's that tolerance for ambiguity, not across the entire organization. There is always a need for a part of the organization that's highly efficient, highly productive, and is cranking out the widgets on a regular basis. But when you start talking about innovation, you've got to take all those policies and procedures or processes and best practices and throw them out the door and give them basically space to be creative and do it in such a way that they aren't frustrated when they go out the door. You want to keep the excitement level up, and you don't get. When's the last time you enjoyed filling out a spreadsheet for your expense report? It's not there. So I rambled a little bit, but that's basically it. Is creating an environment where we teach a leadership course. Well, it's not really a course. It's a day seminar for people who want to be managing innovation. The first thing we say is your job changes. First off, you don't enforce the rules. Your job is now to break the rules. And boy, does that have a weird reaction with people. But that really is. If you're in charge of innovation, your role is to break the rule. You cannot be a traditional, okay, give me the status reports, let me know where. You have to be engaged. You have to be as much of the team as the team members are, or at least perceived by the team. Also something that a lot of management's not particularly prepared for. And then lastly, you actually have to be a contributor. And what I mean by a contributor is you don't tell them what to do, but you tell them the context within which you want it accomplished. So it's, yes, we're Dell and we're great and we're doing all of this great and innovative things. I don't need to necessarily go invest in the self-driving car. Okay? That's outside of the context. Now, if you understand Google's Alphabet's business model, you realize that it's well within Alphabet, because all along, Sergey had this idea of having all of these individual little companies doing these things, which are tech. And by the way, you can't have a self-driving car if you don't have the information base that Google has in place. So you can. It's different, and it's actually the opposite of what most people learn in management schools.
There's a question that came in from Matt Santala that maybe relates to this as a good addition, Jim. Do large companies foster failure in hopes of larger success from their innovators? And will companies consistently push their innovators beyond their limits to increase their bounds, expecting failure before success?
The answer to that is there are a few companies that really do create environments of innovation, and I mentioned Google. That's a good example. For most now, and it also helps to be so wealthy that you have, you can throw money away to have that kind of an environment. Like I was saying, what we're seeing most companies do is their innovation focus is really a search function, in that the innovation is not necessarily going on inside the company. The innovation is going on in identifying startups and universities and patent filings and whatever that have the opportunity to be innovative within the market and the business model that they currently have. So we don't see, and even 3M is often held up as being a paragon of innovation. Then 3M needed to meet Wall Street expectations. They started focusing a little differently. They brought in the Six Sigma TQM people, and as their efficiency goes up, their innovation ability went down, and they've started to respond to that. So the answer is and by the way, I think we were talking before we came on, would almost be unethical for a large company to bet the bank on innovation. Somebody like Google can get away with it. One could even argue that Apple is not being all of that innovative anymore. They have gotten to be so much of a financial institution that really what they are doing is they're behaving more like a traditional large company, which is the next generation of the same exact thing that I'm doing. Although some of the things they're doing with Apple TV and whatever in Siri will be different. But the key point is, if you're in charge of a large company, you have a much higher level of responsibility to a much larger audience of people. You have your shareholders, you have the employees, you have all of the suppliers that are associated with your company. So even though I pick on them for being risk adverse, there's a good reason for them to be risk averse. If you really want to be innovative, you really want to be out. And by the way, it's hard to be innovative if every time you have a problem, all you have to do is write a check to solve it. Because when you write the check to solve it, what are you doing? You're applying somebody else's best practice to what you're doing. The real innovation comes when you're MacGyver in the middle of the desert and you got to create an airplane out of duct tape and reeds. That's where innovation comes from. So it doesn't say that large companies aren't being innovative. Large companies are investing in innovation. They're like I said, they're the pawn. Rarely does the innovation come from them, but they may have facilitated or accelerated it or even enabled it because they were spending on R&D inside of a university setting, or they were partial investors in that startup, or they included that startup inside their R&D labs. In fact, you see that Dell does a lot of that. We have a lot of startup companies that are actually part of our laboratories and how we do things. So I'm not sure I totally answered the question, but it's not one of getting the employees. And by the way, I don't think you can get anybody to be innovative. I think innovation is something you got motivated to do something because you saw a problem that you were interested in solving. Very rarely do you have contract innovation. And when you do, it's generally a government contract associated with the Department of Defense, and then you're just really throwing money at trying to find the answer to the solution, rather than you're really going out to solve a problem that your heart and soul is engaged in.
So I'm going to tack on a question to this because I want to clarify or get some clarity on what you're saying. I know you say you can't get people to do innovation. Do you mean that you can't force them to innovate? You can create a culture that enables innovation.
Exactly. You can have a demand pull. You cannot have a push. You can create an environment where if somebody gets the idea, they can pursue it. You can create an environment where you see challenges and opportunities, and you can broadcast them. In fact, that's the basis of open innovation and crowdsourcing. Is I have a problem, and I have this trusted group that I share all of my problems with. The totality and transparency of the problem and the implications of the problems and the constraints of the problems and the limitations of what I can do. and allow them to then come up with ideas because it's interesting and intriguing to them, not because their next bonus is dependent upon it. If you're really interested, there is you can Google this. If you Google RSA Dan Pink, you will come to something, a video that he has, which talks about the intrinsic motivation of people and how do you get people to be problem solvers, innovators, and creative. And it's not anything that we're taught in management school. It's a 15-minute video. You'll laugh through the entire thing and go, aha.
So the name of this is STEM Talks.
Yes.
I know earlier we were talking about Dell in particular incorporates STEAM. Normally STEAM, we think of architecture, but you said so more on the arts side. I mean, obviously architecture is in many ways art, but you harped specifically on the difference between architecture and art.
Yeah.
And one of the questions we have is, where do you see STEM going in the future, the education system, and how do you see STEM influencing the future in innovation? So what do you think on that?
It's a long and involved answer.
I seem to give you a lot of those questions.
We don't have a time. All my answers are long and involved, aren't they? First off, let me go back to the original comment that I made. My environment is an environment of engineers. I don't have a science, technology, engineering, mathematics problem with my workforce. In fact, I have the exact opposite. I have too many of them, facetiously. So one of the things that we've introduced is this idea of STEAM. Put the A in the middle and basically introduce arts. And there's a couple of reasons for doing that. I railed a little bit about the education system knocking all of the creativity out of people. When if you're not dealing at the PhD level, that's absolutely true in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The creativity goes away. It's beat out of people because it becomes important to always get the one right answer. And you're told this is how we answer those questions. And in fact, if you think about it, that's the whole point of the definition of a master. A master is not expected to generate new knowledge. A master is expected to be a master of the existing knowledge. If it's the existing knowledge, it has not necessarily got a lot of creativity associated with it. So the reason we focus on the idea of the arts is if you think about it, if you're going to be a successful innovator, there's a F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that says the evidence of an intelligent man is the ability to keep two totally conflicting ideas in his mind at the same time and still function. Well, if you're an innovator, you have to do that, because you have to not only come up with a creative good idea, but you also have to understand the necessary engineering and business principles of whether that idea is going to basically be real and have a market value or whatever you want with it. And what we talk about is the two conflicting ideas are not ideas, but they're modes of thinking. We call it convergent thinking and divergent thinking. STEM basically teaches convergent thinking, detail, fact-oriented, the focus and logic that's associated with that. Convergent thinking is where you think holistically. You think of the system as a whole rather than component and piece parts, and it's really the nature of where we find artists. So what we want to do is we want to introduce the idea of divergent thinking into environments that are heavily convergent thinking. The other thing that we want to do is think about what an artist does. I was talking about that innovation comes from continuous failure. An artist has no book that they can look up and say, that painting I just did meets all of the best practices, checks all of the boxes of success, it's going to make me $1 million. An artist creates and then puts it out for the world for the rest of us to basically throw stones at. Artists more than, people talk a little bit about artists, especially if you're in the engineering world, but the fact of the matter is they've got more courage than all of us put together, because they never know whether they've been successful or not until the rest of the world tells them, and they have no way of knowing whether, there is no great artist that did a paint by numbers project. They're being creative, they're trying things out, and then they put it out, and the world either likes it or doesn't like it. Artists are maybe a little bit different, and they don't care whether we like it or don't like it, but they're putting it out there for that evaluation and test. So that's another mode of art that has to be introduced. Is this willing to do continuous experimentation? Because that's really what art is at the end of the day.
So do you think there's a way to mix them, or maybe insert some kind of form into the STEM education system?
I think it's something that's going to evolve over time, because right now, for whatever reason, we have a huge shortage of convergent thinkers. I mean, we really do have a shortage of them. So I'm not saying that we should go do anything about it today. And understand there's a difference between applying STEM, and we use the expression "keep the lights on" to keep society functioning, versus applying STEM to create for innovation and creativity. We have a huge shortage just in keeping the lights on in terms of engineers. Now, whether it's good news or bad news, our machines are getting better at doing that for themselves. The deep learning tools, the prescriptive and predictive analytics. So they're getting a little bit better at being able to do it for themselves, but we still have a serious shortage associated with that.
All right. I know we've touched a lot on being able to accept failure makes a great innovator, and being able to learn from it. But is there anything we can work into our own personal schedules, like our everyday life, that would help us become an innovator?
That's a great question. One of the things that I do, and you'll probably, I don't know if you've worked in large companies, so you may not appreciate the humor in what I'm about to say. One of my major projects right now on innovation is with the Dell HR department. Okay. Obviously, some of you appreciated that. And the issue is the new, we get all of these forecasts and science fiction stories and whatever, and the head of HR came to me one day and said, we just realized that there may not be a need for an HR department in the future, because we have a whole generation, the millennials and the Zs, who really don't want full-time jobs. They want to work on what they're interested in working on. They want to work with people they want to work with. They don't care who they work for. They want to work for 6, 9, 12, 18 months and then take 3 or 4 months off and go do something somewhere in the world. They don't even like to, they don't work 8 to 5. Now, interestingly, they work 24 by 7 by 52. They just do it in 15, 30, and hour increments throughout the 24 hours of the day. And when you start thinking about that, then why do you need an HR department for? Because benefits are kind of going away. Benefits become given by society as a whole. Payroll is generally handled by somebody else for you anyway. If you're always doing gigs or contracts or those kinds of things, and you've taken over responsibility for your own career, then, and by the way, almost every millennial and Z that I talk to wants to be an entrepreneur, so that kind of tells you where everything is going. By the way, it fits in well for my Darwinian crucible pond model. So when you start looking at that, suddenly, what's the role of HR? Well, it turns out, and we've just got through some of the science fiction story writing, that there's really a lot of roles, but not necessarily anything they're doing today. So, when you start putting this together, you start saying that, okay, what is it that's necessary for you to be more innovative? And dealing with the HR people was not unlike dealing with the engineers. And so one of the things we started doing is we start having a weekly brain teaser, true out of the box, the problems that you can't solve inside the box. You have to get out of the box to solve. So we started doing that with the HR team that's involved in this. The other thing is we run exercises that are very similar to Sherlock Holmes famously said, "Watson, you look, but you do not see." So we set up situations where the answer is blazingly obvious, but nobody will notice it because they aren't looking holistically at what they're doing. So what I suggest to people is there's all kinds of creativity. I'm talking to a STEM audience, so obviously I'm going to go to the creative side of things. There is a whole bunch of great books. Robert Ock has got Kick in the Seat of the Pants, A Whack on the Side of the Head. There's even something called the Whack Pack, which is the whack on the side of the head reduced down to a set of cards that you can play with. All of those are great vehicles to introduce this idea of creativity. The other thing is I suggest people actually take a little bit of introductory business, and the reason for that is one, you'll learn a lot of things that you really shouldn't do, which is always a good experience. But you'll also understand how other people are thinking about things. As engineers, sometimes you come up with the greatest idea that since sliced bread, and you can't understand why the business people won't accept it. Well, part of this learning process of failure is, okay, why am I being rejected? If I understand why I'm being rejected, then I'm more likely to be able to keep that rejection from happening in the first place. That's why a lot of artists suddenly become, we produce the same painting over and over. What are there's some stores you could go into, malls that are dedicated to one artist who figured out how to commercialize what he was doing. Creativity and innovation went away, but basically they commercialized. Well, that's one of the things you can learn. So I think it's really developing this whole divergent thinking. And like I said, we encourage our engineers to go to improv classes. I mean, think about it. It's a great way to build up your creativity. Then being able to, we didn't talk about it, but we actually have some attributes we tied to innovation, and your ability to work with those attributes will increase your ability to be an innovator. The first attribute is we call, it has to be forward thinking, or it has to be a new idea. The more you read, the more you're exposed, then you understand what's a new idea versus what's an old idea. Just exposure gets you that. Then it has to be forward thinking. I think I shared with you guys, and it may have been on the before we got on live, is I encourage my team to read a science fiction book every year, at least one science fiction book every year. Science fiction writers are great. If you really look at science fiction, one of the things they do is they look at the world as it exists and they say, okay, what if we change just this one thing? What's the consequences of all of that? A lot of innovation is just saying, okay, what are we assuming that if we just get rid of that assumption, what opens up for us? So I encourage reading science fiction. We talk about feasibility. That's having an understanding of where technology is and where technology is going. Not the technology, but the capabilities the technology needs to be able, that it enables. One of the things when I deal with my engineers is I tell them, quit thinking in terms of the technology, think in terms of the capabilities of the technology. Don't tell me how fast the CPU runs. Tell me about the problems we can address now that we have a CPU that runs that fast. So once you start thinking that way, not in terms of your discipline, but in terms of the outcomes and the value proposition of your discipline, now you're moving into a world where you're more likely to be innovative. Because, there may be a point where we don't need a faster processor, but we may have more than a gazillion different ways to apply those processors to it. I talked a little bit about the innovation having to be viable, having a background a little bit in what does it take to actually run production and make something that you can do over and over again, because innovations are not innovations if they only fit one or two people. And then lastly, that it's valuable, and that's where the business education comes in. What is the likelihood somebody is willing to give up something they have for what you're talking about? So it's at the end of the day, innovation is a gestalt exercise, understanding all of the piece parts and how they fit together, and then what parts can I tweak to cause an outcome that doesn't currently exist. Another long answer, sorry.
But a great answer, and that was a great question, Kylie. And we're toward the end of the hour, so I was really glad that you asked that, because I think that is a great question to end on. To our viewers, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for joining us throughout the series this fall. And I especially want to thank Jim Stikeleather for joining us tonight as well and sharing so much insight about innovation. This has been great, Jim. Thank you for your time.
Well, I enjoyed it. And when do I get my check?
We'll get it in the mail to you, Jim.
I heard that before.
We'll be announcing a spring series as well, and until then, we wish everybody a happy holidays, and we wish our students good luck on their exams as the semester comes to an end. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.